Now comes I, Jean Shaner, on behalf of defendant Mitch Ritchie, moving to appeal from the decision made in State of Indiana versus Mitch Ritchie, to reverse the decision and to acquit and release Mitch Ritchie immediately. I bring this motion based on the ineffective assistance of counsel for defendant Mitch Ritchie in the State of Indiana versus Mitch Ritchie. In the case, there are two issues of law: the admission of Nurse Bo Derek Morgan's testimony regarding Ritchie's medical treatment and the admission of statements from the prosecution on the other two fires following the grant of the motion to bifurcate. Mitch Ritchie's defense team should have filed a motion in limine to exclude Nurse Bo Derek Morgan's testimony and a motion in limine to limit the prosecution's use of statements on the other two fires. A motion in limine should have been filed to exclude Nurse Bo Derek Morgan's testimony, as it violates Federal Rule of Evidence 501, along with the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, also known as HIPAA. Though FRE 501 does not explicitly provide for a physician-patient privilege, it does provide that, in cases in which the law of a particular state applies, the privilege of the law of that state also applies. Indiana Code 34-1-14-5 recognizes physician-patient privilege. The rationale behind physician-patient privilege is twofold. First, the privilege exists in the interest of maintaining the patient's privacy in matters related to medical diagnosis and treatment. Second, much like the attorney-client privilege, the recognition of the privilege promotes free and complete communication between a patient and his or her physician. Functionally, the physician-patient privilege prevents the physician or any other medical caregiver from producing medical records or from testifying about a patient's medical treatment. For a physician to be able to testify in court regarding a patient and his or her treatment, the patient would either have to waive the right to the privilege, or the judge would have had to order the release of the medical records. HIPAA takes it a step further and prohibits the disclosure of patient identity along with the medical records and history of treatment. Nurse Bo Derek Morgan's testimony violated both physician-patient privilege, since Ritchie did not waive the privilege, nor did the judge order the release of the medical records, and HIPAA, since Nurse Morgan disclosed Ritchie's identity. Considering that Nurse Bo Derek Morgan's testimony was a violation of Mitch Ritchie's constitutional rights, any evidence derived from the violation was also inadmissible through the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine, established in Silverthorne Lumber Company v. United States and Nardone v. United States. The fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine will encompass several things in this case, as Nurse Morgan's testimony was heavily relied upon: the search warrant and anything that was obtained under the warrant, Detective Walt Jeremy's testimony, and fire investigator Jenna Ireland's testimony. Nurse Bo Derek Morgan's breach of privilege and HIPAA identified Mitch Ritchie as being treated at IU Ball Memorial Hospital's emergency department for severe chemical burns on 4/16/2019. This information was used for arguing probable cause in seeking the search warrant for 200 West University Avenue, Muncie, Indiana, 73 West Wills, Muncie, Indiana, Units 23 and 36 of the Sunshine Trailer Park in Muncie, Indiana, and Mitch Ritchie's person. Although eyewitness Duff Evans had potentially identified Ritchie as a suspect, it would not have been enough to establish probable cause and grant a search warrant without the information that Nurse Morgan had shared with Detective Walt Jeremy. Subsequently, since Nurse Morgan's testimony was so vital to obtaining the search warrant, all fruits of the search warrant will be poisonous, including the laptop handed over by Ritchie's wife, the search of which led to the discovery of the Amazon.com receipts for the purchase of meth manufacturing-related products. Nurse Bo Derek Morgan's inadmissible testimony also led to the identification of Mitch Ritchie as a suspect by Detective Walt Jeremy. Detective Jeremy reiterated this information in his testimony and admitted that Nurse Morgan's testimony led him to hone in on Ritchie as the primary suspect. Fire investigator Jenna Ireland also named Mitch Ritchie as a suspected perpetrator in her testimony, presumably based on Nurse Morgan's testimony, as investigator Ireland did not physically see Ritchie commit any crimes. As mentioned earlier, eyewitness Duff Evans had already identified Ritchie as a possible suspect. However, eyewitness identification is much less reliable than the identification of a patient by a medical professional, aka an expert witness. Evans' testimony alone would not have been enough to establish Ritchie as the primary suspect. The gravity of not moving to exclude Nurse Bo Derek Morgan's testimony would be grounds for appeal in and of itself, and the implications for Ritchie and the violation of his constitutional rights were disastrous, to say the least. However, there is yet another issue to focus on: the prosecution team's problematic use of statements pertaining to the other two fires, even after Judge Inyart granted the motion to bifurcate the trials. Before the trial, Mitch Ritchie's defense team filed a motion to bifurcate Count 1, arson, and Count 2, the manufacturing of dangerous drugs, from Counts 3 and 4, both arson. Ritchie's defense team argued that without a bifurcation, the admittance of evidence pertaining to the second two counts of arson would be more prejudicial than probative, and further would violate FRE 404b1. FRE 404b1 states that the evidence of a crime, wrong, or other act is not admissible to prove a person's character in order to show that on a particular occasion the person acted in accordance with the character. FRE 404b2 states that similar evidence may be admissible for another purpose, such as proving motive, opportunity, intent, preparation, plan, knowledge, identity, absence of mistake, or lack of accident. However, since Judge Inyart granted the motion to bifurcate the trials, the statements made by the prosecution on the other counts should not have been permitted. In her opening arguments, the state's prosecutor, Obie Rathburn, mentioned counts 3 and 4 of arson. Prosecutor Rathburn claimed that Mitch Ritchie recklessly created a home meth lab which resulted in the fire at 73 West Wills. She further claimed that Ritchie attempted to cover up the explosion of his meth lab by setting 2 other fires, thereby giving the illusion that a serial arsonist was at work in the community. Given the fact that the motion to bifurcate counts 3 and 4 had been granted by Judge Inyart, this type of statement should not have been allowed, as the prosecution was clearly using it as evidence of guilt for count 1 of arson. This kind of character evidence is clearly prohibited by FRE 404b1. However, Ritchie's defense team failed to file a motion in limine to exclude any testimony from the prosecution involving counts 3 and 4. Aside from the prosecution's mentions of counts 3 and 4 of arson being a violation of FRE 404b1, the evidence and claims that were introduced by the prosecution likely were so prejudicial to the jury that Mitch Ritchie could not have received a fair trial. The jury may have been so inclined to assume automatically that Ritchie was guilty of the crime which he was being presently charged with due to the introduction of the other counts of arson by the prosecution. Though the evidence of the second 2 counts of arson was likely probative to the trial, the prejudicial effect far outweighed any probative value. A defendant is entitled to go to trial with a clean slate and be tried on the facts of the case at hand. If a motion to bifurcate counts 3 and 4 was granted, then counts 3 and 4 of arson were not involved in the case at hand. The issue of ineffective assistance of counsel implies that a defendant's Sixth Amendment rights to adequate representation and the right to a fair trial has been violated. In the case of State of Indiana versus Mitch Ritchie, it is not difficult to see that Ritchie's rights to adequate representation were far undermined with the failure to file a motion in limine to exclude Nurse Bo Derek Morgan's testimony and a motion in limine to exclude statements from the prosecution regarding counts 3 and 4 of arson following the grant of the motion to bifurcate. I, Jean Shaner, on behalf of defendant Mitch Ritchie, respectfully request this honorable court for a reversal in the conviction made in State of Indiana versus Mitch Ritchie, for Mitch Ritchie to be acquitted of all charges brought against him, and for the immediate release of Mitch Ritchie.